My boyfriend spent a lifetime inventing a time machine. He wants to go back in time and win back his first love. I secretly followed him back in time. Then I saw him, whom I had taught how to love step by step, gently holding the hand of his first love and saying, "In the past, I didn't know how to love, I hurt your heart, now I've learned." On the second day after coming back in time, I met Lenny. At Tina's birthday party, he appeared in the private room with a cake he made himself, and carefully selected gifts. Under the dim candlelight, his gaze was full of deep affection. The ambiguous atmosphere reached its peak in an instant, as everyone stood by waiting for Tina to make a wish and blow out the candles. Then they goaded the two of them to kiss. I stood quietly on the outskirts of the crowd, watching Tina lean in and kiss Lenny on the cheek, holding roses in her hand. My roommate standing next to me introduced. "That's Tina's boyfriend, isn't he so handsome? Not only that, he is also very considerate, gentle and caring, always maintaining a distance from girls, he's simply perfect." I responded quietly to my friend. "Indeed, mature and reliable, very good at taking care of people. After all, that's what I taught him painstakingly over 5 years." Lenny didn't start out like this. He had a bad temper, no patience, was impulsive, easily angered, and arrogant. The relationship with Tina lasted less than 2 years, and it finally ended when Tina vented all her dissatisfaction and fell in love with his friend. Lenny was not willing to accept it. So, he spent several years studying a time machine, learning how to love someone as I taught him, and without hesitation, left me to travel back to the time when Tina and he had just started dating in their sophomore year. Even though it was one more day, it would have been our 5th anniversary. But he couldn't wait. Now, we have become strangers who have never met. As Tina was the star of the birthday party, the topic of conversation revolved around her and Lenny. Some asked her how to find such a perfect boyfriend. Others asked if Lenny had any friends as handsome as him. There were even some half-jokingly comments. "Have you heard of planting trees for the benefit of later generations? Is it possible that Lenny's thoughtfulness and considerateness were all taught by his ex-girlfriend?" On hearing this, Lenny was not annoyed, still smiling faintly, and then held Tina's hand, as if confessing, and also promising. "There's no ex-girlfriend, Tina is my first love, and the only person I love." Of course, he had no ex-girlfriend, because it was the 2nd year after their breakup when Lenny and I got together. I'm not a predecessor, but a successor. But that didn't stop him from using the ways I taught him to love me on Tina. The light in the private room flickered, and the crowd swayed, so he never saw me standing in the corner throughout the event. Not until after the cake was cut, when Tina was introducing me to his friends and sending the cake, did Lenny finally notice me. I don't know how to describe the expression in his eyes when he saw me, a frozen smile on his lips, a flash of inexplicable panic in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. Then, when Tina introduced me as Yuna, my classmate, he stared at me absent-mindedly. I maintained a perfect light smile, watching Tina tug at his sleeve and frown, asking, "What's wrong? Do you know each other?" It was only then that Lenny snapped back, handed me a small piece of the cake, and coldly said, "I don't know her." I sat on the single sofa holding the cake, looking at Lenny, who had already returned to the center of the crowd. In the flickering and flowing light, with his tall stature and long legs, his features were striking. He was indeed extraordinarily handsome. Especially his eyes, deep as ink. Whenever he looked at someone with seriousness and devotion, he would always appear innocent yet affectionate. So, being with him for 5 years, no matter how angry or upset I might be, as long as I saw his face, and he looked at me quietly, calling out softly, "Nana," I would immediately surrender, and forgive him effortlessly. The small cake in my hand emitted a faint orange blossom fragrance, and my roommate, spoon in mouth, mumbled, "Yuna, you have to try it, it's really super delicious." He's so thoughtful. Now my standard for a boyfriend has to be raised again. I curved my lips and tasted a small bite. A very familiar taste. It was the one I taught Lenny to make. It took me half a month, patiently accompanying him through countless attempts, carefully guiding him step by step until he learned. He looked at me earnestly, and said, Yuna, once I've learned, I'll make a cake for your every birthday with my own hands. He learned, but he never made one for me. In fact, in the trajectory of fate in the previous life, my first encounter with Lenny was not at this birthday gathering. Because I wasn't actually familiar with Tina. She had invited the whole class to her birthday party, and I, who had no intention of attending, was dragged along by my roommate. So, in the previous life, after a short while of delivering gifts and well wishes, I left early. Thus, I missed Lenny's belated arrival. It was only when I returned to the dormitory that night and heard my roommates mention him. Yuna, you left early and didn't get to see Tina's boyfriend, an extremely handsome guy. It's a pity he seems cold and aloof, looking impatient throughout the whole gathering. Leaving aside their personalities, they do look quite well matched in terms of appearance. I'm not very curious about other people's affairs, and even less so about another girl's boyfriend. So, after hearing that, I just smiled nonchalantly, and stopped paying attention, never even asking his name. It wasn't until later, when Lenny and I were together, that I accidentally saw a photo in his study, and realized that he was the handsome guy I had missed seeing before. Tina's boyfriend. However, I didn't mind, after all, who doesn't have a past? But now, we have returned to the past. Unlike in the previous life, this time, almost everyone praised Lenny. Perhaps the atmosphere around them was too lively, leaving me feeling somewhat lonely in the corner. With an indescribable emotion, I unconsciously drank a few more glasses of fruit wine. Feeling a little tipsy and lost, I couldn't distinguish whether this was real or an illusion. So, I got up and went to the outdoor terrace, letting the wind blow for a long time, and when I returned to my senses, the crowd had dispersed. With my fingers on the half-open compartment door, I saw Lenny crouched next to the sofa where Tina lay, gently holding her hand, and said softly, I didn't know how to love in the past, I hurt your heart, but now I've learned. It had to be admitted that Lenny, who possessed exceptional natural talent for learning, could master anything if he wanted to. So after that birthday party, I started hearing frequently about everything Lenny did for Tina. Like bringing her a rose every time he visited her, picking out shrimp, and deboning fish for her at dinners, and even creating little romantic gifts by hand. Oh, and he would occasionally come to accompany Tina to class. And the only time we met after returning from the past was at Tina's birthday party. Until today. My roommate and Tina were participating in a team-building hiking event organized by the same guitar club, and she begged me to come along to help take pictures for her. Nana, please, I really admire your composition, lighting, and color style. I'll treat you to a big meal, when we're back. In her relentless, pleading, I agreed. So, I carried my camera, and followed her to the meeting point, only to find Lenny with Tina. He was wearing a black and white tracksuit, standing in the crowd and listening intently to Tina. Perhaps he noticed my gaze on him, because he turned to look at me, and I casually averted my eyes. My roommate exaggeratedly introduced my photography skills to her friends. Yuna, a self-taught photography maestro, unrivaled in lighting and composition. I was amused by her words, and politely offered to take photos if anyone needed. From then on, people kept trading small snacks for my help in taking pictures. Until Tina pulled Lenny over and asked with a smile, Yuna, could you take a picture for us too? I smiled and nodded, positioning my camera to capture them. But before I could capture the moment, my roommate loudly asked, Lenny, why aren't you smiling? Look at Yuna and smile. Silently, I waited for the moment Lenny forced a smile, and quickly took a few shots. Later, on the bus ride back, we all looked at the photos together, and after receiving polite and joyful praise from everyone, we came across the ones my roommate took of me. They were actually quite good, except for one where the lens was focused on the face of a passerby, who unintentionally appeared in the frame behind me. He was a guy wearing a black hoodie, gray pants, and a cap that partially covered his bangs. Amidst the laughter, someone suddenly said, there's a saying online, isn't there? You two are strangers, captured in the same frame. Could it be that in another time and space, you really know each other? After hearing that, the smile on my face finally faded away. What he said was true. I did know this guy from a previous life. His name was Jim. My first love. I actually hadn't seen him in a very long time. Not since the day he died on our second anniversary. It's just that my life seemed to have perpetually stopped on the day he died. Stuck in a pause, hanging in midair. Now, time has reversed, and we haven't met yet. My wandering thoughts were abruptly brought back by a sudden breaking, causing the camera to slip from my hand, but Lenny caught it with quick reflexes. After calming my nerves, I was about to ask for it back when I noticed he was frowning and staring at the photo. The next moment, my roommate looked over and exclaimed in surprise, "Lenny, he looks a lot like you." I didn't know what Lenny was thinking at the moment when his fingers suddenly tightened, but he was definitely a substitute. Regarding my being with Lenny, it was actually his suggestion. But I knew better than anyone that Lenny was not Jim, nor was he a resemblance of him. So when I was with him, at first I carried a sense of guilt and regret, because my only purpose was to see his face. It wasn't until I accidentally found out about his first love being Tina, and the drunken remark he made about waiting until I learn how to love someone before I come find you, that I realized belatedly what he meant by, "I don't know how to love. Can you teach me how to love you?" He didn't love me, it was a matter of mutual benefit. So I began to use him as a substitute without guilt. I started to teach him the ways in which Jim loved me. I finally understood why in most martial arts dramas, the protagonist's lover being deceased, a phantom can keep them trapped. Clearly knowing it's not the real lover, yet willingly sinking into it. I also realized quite soberly that this was undeniably a form of seeking solace in desperation. But fate made me see the scattered information in his study. At the time I was most inclined to give up, about wormholes, black holes, the speed of light, about the time dilation effect, time reversal, and time travelers. And a sentence that seemed to have been casually written down. Travelers can only travel back to their own past bodies. In that moment when my heart suddenly raced, an incredible guess inexplicably surfaced in my mind. After being with Lenny, the most profound impression he left on me wasn't his inability to love, but his intelligence, an extreme kind of intelligence. The entire wall of certificates, trophies, and the title of a physics genius, all highlighted the brilliance and smoothness of his journey, while also giving him a touch of unbearable pride. He didn't understand how to humble himself in love. Until he broke up with Tina. That was probably the only problem he faced that couldn't be solved, so he obsessively tried every method to find an answer. And then returned to conquer. Honestly, I didn't know if Lenny's obsession was about not getting Tina, or about the only failure in his life, and I didn't know if he really intended to reverse time and go back, and I didn't know if he could succeed. But what if he did? So I pretended to know nothing, and continued to be with him, year after year, surpassing the time he and Tina were together, and surpassing the time I was with Jim. Until the day before our 5th anniversary, I made a phone call to him. "Lenny, let's talk, when you come back." I wanted to break up. Unexpectedly, he remained silent for a long time, on the other end of the phone, and then gently said, "Yuna, I might not be able to spend the 5th anniversary with you. I'm sorry." I furrowed my brows, about to say it didn't matter, then the call was hung up. Frozen in place holding my phone for a few seconds, I suddenly realized what he meant. Almost without hesitation, I rushed to his, now empty laboratory. And then, we went from being a couple to strangers. He handed in a perfect answer, becoming Evrion's model boyfriend. I also had the chance to save Jim, changing his predestined demise. Just as how I didn't care about Lenny's past with Tina, he also didn't care about who I was with. So I thought, regarding Jim as my first love. Lenny would never know. The camera ultimately returned to my hands. Lenny didn't say anything, just turned his head and looked silently out of the window. I didn't have time to think about anything else. My eyes fell on the photo, and my mind was filled with Jim. I suddenly understood something. Despite how much I wanted to maintain the development of the previous life, waiting to have our first encounter at the basketball court, the current trajectory had deviated due to one tiny change after another. like this photo of him appearing in it. For instance, the next day during the public lecture, he sat next to me. I've heard people say that music and scent are carriers of memory. Indeed. Because the moment Jim sat down, the familiar light orange scent almost overwhelmed all of my reactions, and struck my heart. It brought back strands of long, intricate pain. I sat stiffly at the table, allowing the passing memories to surge and intertwine like a tide, from romantic scenes to vivid fragments of time spent together, until the second before the accident, when he turned the steering wheel towards me. Then he died in front of me, at the time when I loved him the most. Interrupting my thoughts was the teacher's question. She called my name, and in the silent classroom, I hesitated for a moment before standing up, unable to speak a word. Because I hadn't heard anything at all. I remembered this teacher, known for calling on students to help those who couldn't answer her questions. So when I remained silent for half a minute, she glanced around at the bowed heads, and calmly asked, "Is there anyone willing to help answer the question?" At that moment, I had not fully awakened from the sad memory. I actually felt that it would be better if no one stood up, so that I could continue to stand there, and use the corner of my eye to keep an eye on Jim sitting next to me. So he wouldn't notice me. His slender fingers pressed on a black pen absent-mindedly as he flipped through the book, then suddenly stood up and said loudly, "I volunteer." Stunned, I turned my head as he stood up, gradually shifting to a sideways glance. But what surprised me even more was that the teacher, adjusting her glasses, asked, "Is the boy in the back also volunteering to answer the question?" Jim and I turned our heads almost simultaneously to the back, and saw Lenny, who came to class with Tina, also standing up. In an instant, countless eyes fell on him. He didn't look at me, but calmly looked ahead and said, "No, I'm going to the restroom." He was going to the restroom, so it was Jim who came to my rescue. As I was about to thank him after sitting down, he suddenly turned his head and whispered to me, "Classmate, your eyes are so red, are you going to cry? It's just a matter of not being able to answer the question, don't cry." In the face of his sudden proximity, I was stunned for a moment before slowly realizing, but I didn't tell him that the soreness and redness in the corner of my eyes were not because I couldn't answer the question. Later, as a token of thanks, I said I would treat him to a meal. After class, I took him to a nearby beef noodle restaurant, and skillfully blurted out to the owner, 2 bowls of beef noodles, no scallions. Turning around, I saw Jim looking at me, with a smile that wasn't a smile, and asked, "How did you know that I also don't like scallions?" I paused for a moment, not knowing how to explain, and then heard him say, "Although I don't know who you were thinking of when you placed the order, and just habitually mentioned a flavor preference, I still have to introduce myself." As he spoke, he reached out his right hand to me, looking at me seriously as he spoke, "Hello, Yuna. I am a first-year graduate student in the medical department at a university, Jim." I knew he was from the neighboring A university, and I also knew that he was actually here to fill in for a friend's class. And this beef noodle restaurant located between the 2 universities was the one we used to visit most often when we were together in the past. Although it has been a long time, I still remember clearly the last time we came here, which was in the 2nd week after Jim left. In psychology, there's a term called emotional isolation defense mechanism, which prevents the brain from collapsing in the face of extreme sadness and pain. So initially, when faced with Jim's death, with the fact that I would never see him again, or hear his voice, I was numb and calm, feeling nothing at all. Looking at the grayish-white photo on the tombstone, I shed not a single tear, only finding it difficult to fall asleep on every quiet night, vividly recalling every scene we once shared. Until one ordinary evening, I came to this restaurant and habitually ordered 2 bowls of beef noodles without scallions. Then when the noodles were brought to the table, I looked at the empty seat across from me, and tears suddenly fell without warning. The emotions that had been suppressed for so long felt like a sudden tear, followed by pain spreading from the heart to the whole body, and tears that couldn't be stopped. Finally, after forcing myself to finish the whole bowl of noodles, I vomited everything out in extreme sadness. Since then, I've never been back to this restaurant. Fortunately, now I'm back where it all started, before the accident happened and Jim hadn't died yet, everything can still be salvaged. I looked at the hand in front of me and gently held it, earnestly explaining to him, I wasn't thinking of anyone. It's just my preference like this, but I misspoke and ordered 2 bowls. He tilted his head and smiled, that's quite a coincidence. From now on, it will always be 2 bowls. It was the last money that Jim paid. To my surprise, he smiled and handed me his phone, saying, it's not gentlemanly for a girl to pay in public. How about this, add me on Weshit and you can transfer the money to me. I added him on Weshit to transfer the money, but he returned it, saying, on the first date, it's not right for the girl to pay. How about you do me a favor instead? They had a free clinic event and asked me to help take photos. A week later, I brought my camera and followed him to the nearby community to capture the scenes of them providing medical care. In the photos, Jim patiently answered residents' questions, checked the blood pressure and blood sugar levels of the elderly, and chatted with the children. The noon sunlight fell on him, in a white coat, as if it had coated him with a soft light, radiant and gentle. If Lenny was like a rare and unattainable flower on the mountain peak, then Jim was like a grand and warm autumn sunshine. They were always different. As the free clinic neared its end, everyone was chatting with the elderly and children. I saw Jim surrounded by a group of kids, and when I walked over, I found him making bamboo joint dolls for them. Amid the chattering voices calling out, Brother Jim, he lowered his head, and skillfully made the dolls with slender bamboo, saying one by one, this is for Round Child, this is for Tung Tung, this is for Bean Bean. I casually took a few photos, and as I looked down to check them, I suddenly heard Jim's voice. I looked up and saw him handing a beautiful bamboo doll to me, jokingly saying, here, everyone gets one. This is for Nana. Later on, Jim and I became friends through several interactions. He helped me garner votes for the most beautiful sunset photography contest, and when we played with clay together, he earnestly molded various human organs. When the couple opposite us finally made a standard heart, he raised the heart in his hand, and said, look, this is a perfect heart. I put down the scattered limbs in my hand, smiled awkwardly at the embarrassed couple opposite, and pulled Jim to change tables. He also took me to meet his Marshall brothers and sisters. Pointing to those who had taken off their white coats, he introduced each one to me. Looking at those familiar faces, I politely greeted them. I remembered that gentle and delicate sister would transform into a cool and handsome motorcycle rider after taking off her white coat. And I also remember that calm and composed brother was actually a master in the sports world. When I appeared, along with Jim's introduction of my friend Yuna, they looked at me with a kind smile and a oh tilde expression on their faces. To be honest, they didn't say anything, but it felt like they had said everything. I felt my cheeks warming under their gazes, and Jim stood in front of me, pleading, brothers and sisters, please go easy on her. Don't scare her. They continued to smile and said with their chins propped up, all right, all right. Once you call us brothers and sisters, you're part of the family. Later on, I also became friends with them, and went to play murder mystery games together, and participated in a music festival jointly organized by universities. I was immersed in this peaceful and lively life, and almost forgot about the fact that I had traveled back in time. Until I met Lenny again. Perhaps because all my attention and thoughts were on Jim at that time, I automatically blocked out my roommate's gossip in the dorm. So when I saw Lenny, I suddenly realized that I hadn't heard his name in a very long time. On a summer night at an outdoor barbecue stall, when I was playing Truth or Dare with Jim and his Marshall brothers and sisters, I suddenly felt a strong gaze on me. Subconsciously, I turned to find Lenny's eyes meeting mine. He and Tina, along with another couple, were sitting at another table. As if deliberately, Tina held Lenny's hand, and, without caring if he was listening, kept talking, then suddenly laughed very happily. The guy opposite her looked very unhappy and remained silent. The atmosphere was harmonious, but there was a subtle undercurrent of tension. The gaze from Lenny made me feel uneasy, but fortunately, the guy sitting opposite Tina suddenly stood up, visibly unhappy, and said he didn't want to eat. They were about to leave. I held the goose leg that Jim gave me, and heard Tina leaning on Lenny's side, saying with a somewhat drunken tone, Lenny, I like you the most. As they passed by our table, My gaze briefly glanced over them, and I found that, both in her actions and words, Tina did indeed seem to like him a lot. But he didn't look happy. This mystery was soon solved. Tina and Lenny broke up. Their roommate from the guitar club would sigh nostalgically during gossip time every evening and announce, "Do you guys know? Tina and Lenny broke up." My pen suddenly halted. I recalled a day in the past when my roommate had mentioned Tina breaking up with her boyfriend. At that time, she had claimed that Tina accused Lenny of not understanding love, and that she couldn't bear to be with him any longer. Their breakup was announced not long after. But now, Lenny had become everyone's ideal boyfriend, and I couldn't understand why they had still broken up. The answer my roommate provided was that Tina had grown weary. Lenny was like a preset robot, who loved her, and it was dull. She then showed me their social media. "Look, she has announced a new relationship, and it's still Lenny's friend." I was speechless upon seeing the post. He was the displeased young man from the barbecue stall that night. My roommate then mysteriously whispered, "The real reason is that Tina never actually liked Lenny. She was only with him to make her longtime crush, Lenny's friend, jealous." Yes, that crush is Lenny's friend, who is now her boyfriend. So, whether Lenny could love someone or not was irrelevant to Tina, because they would ultimately break up. And Lenny, who believed he had the correct answer, had finally realized the question was wrong. Amidst a chorus of lamenting, another roommate asked, "Did Lenny just accept it like that, without trying to salvage the relationship? He clearly seemed to like Tina a lot." "No, I heard that he calmly accepted it, and didn't say anything about trying to salvage the relationship." I found this absurd and instinctively didn't want to accept the fact, because it made me feel that what was meant to happen would eventually happen. This feeling peaked when I saw Lenny again a week later. I found a lost child in the downtown mall, and took her to the broadcast station, where we awaited her mother's arrival. A very elegant and beautiful woman, dressed in an expensive navy cheapao, came over, took the child's hand, and thanked me. She then invited me to have tea at the tea house downstairs. Despite my repeated refusals, she insisted due to her conscience, and as we passed through the wooden screen, I saw Lenny sitting at a square table, dressed in a light gray sweater, sipping tea. Distant memories were instantly stirred. Although the timing was off, in a past life, I had first met Lenny because I had found this child. It was just that in the past, the person who came to the broadcast station to pick up the child was Lenny. She was his cousin's daughter. Lenny's parents were both researchers and were often not by his side, so he had always been distant with familial affection. During the 5 years I was with him, I hardly ever saw any of his relatives. So, this cousin and her daughter, whom I had only met once, had been forgotten over time. But I hadn't anticipated that a similar situation, with a slight deviation, would happen again. The girl's mother explained that this was her cousin, and then turned to Lenny and said, "It was this girl who helped find her. Her name is Yuna." Upon hearing this, Lenny put down his teacup, and calmly said, "Yes, I know her." I'm not sure how to describe the feelings I had at that moment. Upon finding out that Lenny and I were alumni, the girl's mother was pleasantly surprised and said, "It really is fate." She then curiously looked between Lenny and me and asked, one from the physics department, and the other from the Chinese department, "How did you two meet?" The private room fell into silence. I pulled my gaze away from the iris flowers lightly swaying across from me, and said gently, "We didn't really meet, he is my classmate's ex-boyfriend, and we only met once." The next moment, Lenny added, "We've already broken up." "Oh, now he's the ex." Perhaps sensing my lack of enthusiasm, the girl's mother didn't inquire further about me, and instead talked with Lenny. I picked up some refreshments and focused on entertaining the little girl next to me while ignoring their conversation. But just before the end, I overheard the girl's mother say meaningfully to Lenny, "When you came back this time, you seem to have changed a lot. Your character is completely restrained. Is it because of that ex-girlfriend?" He shook his head gently. "No, she doesn't like me, and I don't like her." "Oh. But you seem to be sad about it." Lenny fell silent for a few seconds, before speaking with a slightly hoarse voice, because I realized too late that I seemed to have missed someone I truly liked. I didn't know what he meant by those words, and I didn't want to know. But after that, our encounters became more frequent. We were trapped under the same roof by heavy rain. We sat at the same table in the cafeteria. Even the campus orange cat that we often fed suddenly appeared at his feet one day. Too many coincidences ceased to be coincidences. So, I reduced my frequency of going out, stopped eating in the cafeteria, and no longer went to feed the orange cat. Some time later, Lenny stood in the hallway of the library that I had to pass through, looking at me, as he asked, puzzled, Yuna, are you avoiding me? Yes, I was indeed avoiding him. After all, there was no longer any relationship between him and me, and I didn't want there to be one again. So, calmly, I spoke, then what identity are you using to stand here and question me? My classmate's ex-boyfriend. He looked at me for a long time, his face pale, and finally turned aside to let me leave. I thought, a proud person like him probably wouldn't come looking for me again. But his breakup, our encounters, and all kinds of things similar to the past, whether early or late, still made me feel a strong sense of unease deep inside. I began to frequently dream of the car accident from my past life. In the dream, I went back to the day of my 2-year anniversary with Jim. He drove to pick me up for a meal, and I held flowers and sat in the passenger seat, sharing with him the travel variety shows I had seen recently, and talking about the places we planned to travel to in the future. He listened quietly to me babbling, occasionally looking at me tenderly, and responding, okay, I'll listen to you. I don't know why, but I felt that something was off with him, but I couldn't figure out what it was at the moment, so I gave up and continued talking to him. When I mentioned how we should celebrate every future anniversary, a truck suddenly ran a red light and crossed the road. In fact, the road was not very crowded at that time, and there weren't many people. As long as the brakes were applied in time, the accident wouldn't have happened. But the brakes failed. Jim unhesitatingly turned the steering wheel towards my side, leaving me the only chance to survive. After the violent impact, I lost consciousness for several seconds. When I opened my eyes, I was in the bloody, pungent-smelling carriage, my whole body in so much pain that I couldn't speak. In my blurry vision, a long piece of debris was stuck in Jim's chest, and he weakly pleaded with the passers-by, who had gathered around, save her first, I beg you, save her first. Later, they pulled me out of the fractured window of the car. The last scene one saw before passing out was the explosion of the car. The investigation results were quickly announced. Besides the driver of the truck, who ran the red light due to fatigue, the brake system of Jim's car had been intentionally tampered with. The criminal was a man burdened with millions of debts due to online loans, who, unable to repay them, developed a mindset of revenge against society and destroyed the brake systems of almost all the cars in that area. So, during that time, the incidence of car accidents was extremely high, and the number of casualties was also very high. I lay on the hospital bed, numbly watching the news on my phone, and quietly listening to the comfort from Jim's senior and junior Marshall siblings, when they came to visit me. It wasn't until they said that Jim was going to propose that day that I understood why there was something wrong with him at the time. The ring was found on Jim's body. It was very beautiful, and I liked it very much. During that time, everyone was advising me to look forward and move on, but I didn't understand. If I left, what would happen to Jim, who was left here? I was awakened by a rapid alarm. I stared blankly at the ceiling, noticing the wetness in the corners of my eyes, and realized that I had cried again. Every detail of that car accident was almost etched into my bones, including the culprit who sabotaged the brake system. But there was nothing I could do now. After all, before he sabotaged the brakes, he was just an ordinary man in debt. I couldn't risk finding him early and causing other unforeseen events. I could only control the changes to the smallest extent, and wait for the day he committed the crime. And it was during this wait that I ended up being with Jim. Before that, I had vaguely sensed the signs of his confession. It started when a senior in the photography department asked me to pretend to be his girlfriend to fend off a girl who was always pestering him. In an elegant and quiet restaurant, the senior put his arm around me, and said to the girl opposite us, I really do have a girlfriend. Look, her name is Yuna. My acting skills were not that good, and I was afraid of giving myself away as soon as I spoke, so I could only work hard to maintain a smile and nod in agreement. The next moment, I unintentionally saw through the frosted partition to the other table, where Lenny and his friend were sitting. He had probably seen everything, and when our eyes met, he suddenly lowered his head, not responding to his friend's questions, just quietly eating his rice. That night, I saw his post on social media, a picture of a broken heart model with the caption, "Heartbroken." The next day, I went to see him with his favorite green plum cake. In the corridor bathed in the setting sun, he stood in front of me looking disheartened, devoid of his usual vigor. I watched him silently take a bite of the cake, and asked him, "Is it sweet?" "Not sweet, it's bitter," he replied. I nodded in understanding and said, "Oh," before changing the subject, and suggesting we try the new roast duck restaurant nearby. He looked at the ground in silence for a while and then, with a slightly lowered voice, asked, "Are you okay with going out for a meal with me, given your boyfriend?" Pretending to be surprised, I asked, "Oh, do you mean the senior from yesterday? I was just helping fend off romantic interests. How was it? Did I act so well that even you were fooled?" Pausing for a moment, I saw his eyes gradually brighten, and I continued, "Even if I did have a boyfriend, just having a meal with a friend, he shouldn't mind, right?" "Do you mind having a boyfriend?" he suddenly interrupted, looking at me with some nervousness. I smiled lightly as our eyes met and casually replied, "It all depends on whether the green plum cake is sweet. I queued for 2 hours to buy it." He hesitated for a moment, then stuffed the remaining half of the green plum cake into his mouth and mumbled, "Sweet, it's so sweet." That night, he posted another social media story, a picture of my profile with the caption, "My lifetime." That's how Lenny and I got together, not with the romantic confession scenes found in novels or idol dramas, but just two hearts holding each other. After that, we, like any other campus couple, spent a period of ordinary but happy time together, until the day marked on my calendar arrived. In the old neighborhood, in the wee hours of the morning, the brake device was sabotaged. But that day wasn't our second anniversary, and his car wasn't there due to various changes. I had to save the remaining people. At first, I was very nervous, afraid of various accidents, but reality turned out surprisingly smooth. To avoid being involved in a crime and being questioned, I reported to the police that I had lost a $20,000 necklace in that area, and the last time I saw it was at 3:30 in the morning. The police quickly obtained surveillance footage, which showed a suspicious man with tools repeatedly appearing near several cars. This led to suspicions and confirmations that had nothing to do with me. As for the necklace, the next day I told the police that I found it in the trash bin. I also heard that a large number of car brakes were damaged that night. The culprit was caught. The long worried about matter probably ended there. But I still felt uneasy in my heart. This unease persisted until 2 weeks later, when Lenny and I went to the cinema. Walking slowly among the crowd, a man with a scar on his right cheek brushed past me, his hidden knife catching my eye as he headed towards a pregnant woman. In the blink of an eye, my actions were almost faster than my thoughts, and before I knew it, I had taken the blow meant for the pregnant woman. I lay on the ground, finally realizing what I had forgotten. The man with the scar was a fugitive. In the previous life, he had died in a car accident caused by brake failure while fleeing, but in this life, the accident had been prevented. He had survived. Everything around me was in chaos, and Lenny knelt beside me, seemingly saying something, the veins on his forehead bulging in his effort. But I couldn't hear anything. I seemed to have walked in the thick fog for a very long time, and finally arrived at the park beside the neighborhood where I was 10 years old. At that time, I was constantly taking hormone medication due to illness, and I had grown very fat. So the other kids would often circle around me, teasing and mocking me. "Fat pig, ugly monster, fat pig, ugly monster." I covered my ears and tried to explain to them. "I'm not a fat pig, I'm sick. I will get better. I'm not a fat pig." No one listened to my explanation, they just laughed, and watched as I squatted on the ground, calling out even more gleefully, Until a young man, looking like a god descended from heaven, coldly warned them. He said that if anyone dared to say another word, he would hang them from a tree, and let the birds poop on them. When they screamed and ran away, the young man squatted in front of me, who dared not look up, and comforted me in a gentle voice. Don't be afraid, I've driven them away. Slowly, I looked up at his handsome face and whispered, Brother, I'm not a fat pig, I'm sick. He smiled gently at me. Yes, I know, you're just sick. You'll get better. After that day, every time I came to the park, I could see him jogging. No one else wanted to play with me, only him. But he was too attractive, so attractive that I felt inferior and sad. I couldn't help but ask him, Brother, what if I never get better? He ruffled my head and said, well, then I'll become a doctor and cure you. From the first meeting to their parting, it was only 11 days. This was the last thing he said to me before he was heard not far away by his mother. Jim, come home for dinner. The next day, my father was caught cheating, and my mother and I moved directly. Since then, I have never seen Jim again. When we met again, he had become a medical student, standing in the crowd, as handsome and dazzling as ever. And my illness had been cured. Later, we accidentally met again on the basketball court, got to know each other, and got together. The person I had secretly loved for nearly 10 years, had also fallen in love with me. Then, before I could ask him whether he remembered me, or not, he died. Fortunately, this time, I saved him. If this is the cost, then I'm willing to bear it. I returned to the unbreakable fog again, feeling as if someone was speaking beside me, but I couldn't react in any way. Faintly, I seemed to hear Jim's voice, as if he was helplessly asking someone beside him. I've studied medicine for so long, why couldn't I save her? Teacher, what should I do? When I came back to consciousness, the ward had become very quiet. Someone was sitting by the bed. I tried my best to lift my eyelids, and saw his face blurrily. It looked like Jim. But it also resembled Lenny. I tried hard to distinguish for a long time, but failed, until he spoke. If I hadn't traveled back, would it have prevented the butterfly effect causing you to get hurt? Or maybe you also traveled back, so you saved the pregnant woman. After saying this, he paused for a moment and then chuckled self-deprecatingly. I've always been unsure whether, in another timeline, you liked me because of him. Or if it was because of my time travel, indirectly leading you to fall in love with him, in this timeline. I'll probably never get the answer to this question, but, Yuna, I regret it. I always thought that all problems could be solved through studying, reasoning, and calculating, but, loving someone isn't. It's unsolvable. Just like how I might never be able to make you, who had fallen in love with him, love me again. I actually didn't want to remember the 5 years I spent with Lenny, but a very small memory surfaced in my mind. It was probably in the 3rd year of our relationship, during the winter, when I accidentally collided with someone while talking to him on the phone on my way home from work, and my phone, with an exclamation, fell accurately through the narrow gap of the rainwater grate into the sewer. I was extremely upset, and I spent the entire night in a taxi with the little money I had on me. It wasn't until the next day that I found out Lenny had been looking for me, all night. I didn't know why he did that, but 2 people with impure intentions from the start were bound to have no results. It's meaningless to say more now. I woke up on a very ordinary evening. I opened my eyes and saw Jim patiently wiping my fingers with his head bowed. I turned my head and softly called out, Jim. The wiping stopped abruptly, he didn't look up, the back of his hand holding the towel bulged with blue veins, and after a moment of silence, he got up and walked out with big strides. I stared at the white ceiling, and silently counted in my mind. When I reached 57, he walked back in. His eyes were red. After a thorough examination showed no major problems, and on the day of my discharge, Jim took me to where he lived, and began to carefully take care of me, revolving around me, all day. I apologized to him. I'm sorry, we've only been together for a short time, and I'm causing you so much trouble. He seemed to be amused, pinched my cheek, placed the soup in front of me, and joked, then drink it quickly, and let the lost flesh grow back soon. I furrowed my brow and shook my head, but I've finally lost some weight, it saves me from dieting. He completely lost his temper and fed me a spoonful of soup with a spoon, coaxing, "Come on, Nana, open your mouth, listen to the doctor, a healthy person is the most beautiful." It was in the half anger, and half coaxing of Jim, that I recovered from my injuries. I met Lenny again in the supermarket 6 months later. I was holding a few oranges and looking for Jim, when I accidentally rolled one. It kept rolling, and finally was picked up by a bending figure. It was Lenny. He stepped closer, and put the orange in my arms. In the silent eye contact, I sincerely said to him, "Lenny, thank you." Just as I finished speaking, Jim's voice suddenly came, he was looking for me. "Nana." I quickly responded with, "I'm coming," and passed by Lenny, who was about to speak. Just as we have brief encounters in this vast universe, but ultimately, we drift apart. That evening, when I returned home and was tidying up the study, I saw a framed photo in the glass cabinet. It was a hand-drawn cartoon figure, a chubby little girl, with the words brother written in the speech bubble above her head. I asked Jim when he recognized me from the photo. He smiled, with a slight lift, at the corner of his eyebrows, and casually flipped the frame over. I was stunned. It was a photo of him, but the camera was focused on me passing by him. The date recorded on it was the day we went hiking. So, the next day he sat down next to me. From then on, our story had a new beginning.